Welcome to the Consumer Code Show, where we believe that humans are incredible and we are living in a first era in history where behavioral data and AI have hit scale so we can go from consumer insight to business activation in no time. In this show, we explore the world of retail through the lens of demography, cartography, ethnography, and the economy. So without further ado, let's get into this episode. Okay. Welcome to Consumer Code. Today, we're talking with Andy Moncla. He is the president of BI Spatial and also an Alteryx Ace. He's worked both on the brand side with Lowe's and VF Corporation and on the consulting side, helping grocers and retailers put mobile data into action. And Andy, I've known of you in the industry for years, but the way that I got to meet Andy is he gave me a call after a blog post that I made, and he's like, "Hey, you know that thing that you did about trade areas? That wasn't so right. And I just want to make sure you know." And then you sent me a very detailed academic case study on that. And then we've been working with each other ever since.
Well, it's no one wants to get called out in public. So, I thought it'd be more tactful to give you a call. So
Yeah. And
anyway,
Andy, I've appreciated our time in this past year. And I feel like there is not one person that I have met that gets the raw mobile data quite like you do, and is also a practitioner. Like, you've been at Lowe's, you've been at VF Corporation, you've been on the other side where it's like
yeah,
there were stakes in getting the answer wrong. You weren't just a consultant. And
that's
so
right.
I really feel like that gives you such an important view and a unique view
Yeah,
when it comes to this. Well, where I want to go in this episode is I want to just establish where you come from and the
okay,
GIS fundamentals that you picked up along the way. Then I want to focus on mobile data specifically for this, because there's a lot of people that use it, sort of like widespread adoption in retail site selection and other different use cases. And you get the watch outs because you work with it. And then lastly, I want to hit on a product that's been around, the mobility grid, but one that we are releasing within Spatial, and I'm really excited about it. It's called the mobility grid. So let's get this kicked off. Let's start with the beginning. You started at Lowe's. What was that like?
well, I'm going to have to date myself. So that was the late '80s. And what it was like was, if you could imagine doing your job without really much computing, the internet, Google Earth, GPS. When we did market research, we would actually have to fly or drive to the markets. Um, and so, in fact, the first time I went on a market review trip, I went with a senior analyst. And when we got to the rental car, he pulled out two suction cup compasses from his briefcase. He licked them and he stuck them to the windshield. I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "You got to know where you're going." I said, "We have a map." He said, "Can't trust them. You gotta have your compasses." And he promptly drove out of the airport and went in the wrong direction. And I said, "Hey, we're going in the wrong direction." And he stopped the car, looked at me and said, "I'm the teacher, you're the student. Just sit there and shut the blankety blank up." I said, "All right." So he drove a couple of miles, and then he stopped. He looked at the maps, cussed a little bit more, did a U-turn, and it turned to me. He said, "Don't you say a word." And so that was my first trip. And what that involved was driving the market. We didn't have a list of competitors. We would have to get a local phone book, and somebody would always
Mm,
tear out the page for hardware or something, and would go verify what the competition was. We'd have to talk to planning departments, and transportation improvement folks, and so we would ride around the market with a fold-out map in our laps with felt pens and mark where all the stores were and where there might be growth and all sorts of stuff like that. So we'd take it back to the office, and then we'd have to enter it into the one computer we had, because we all shared the same computer. We were using a system called Conquest, Donnelly Marketing Information Services, and so we had demographics. We could draw a trade area and get that data, but every bit of our research was in the field, and that's why when I said boots on the ground on one of your former posts, I said you got to do both and verify what's going on. So
Yeah, I
that's
mean
what it was like.
the positive and negative of that is like you
Yeah,
had to do boots on the ground because you
yeah,
just couldn't go buy a POI data set.
yeah.
But the negative is, well,
It
that's
s
that's a positive, is
s
and the
it
negative just takes
slows
so
it
long.
down. So, so I think the best approach is use your data at your fingertips on your computer, uh, and then before you spend the money, before you take it to the real estate committee, go ahead and, verify all those necessary components.
And then let's jump to VF Corporation, and you and I have really not talked about this. And I think retail site selection can be much more straightforward when you're just doing it for your own physical
Yeah.
space. But in VF, you are working through wholesalers. What was different about that and the types of analysis that you did?
Well, even prior to that, when I left Lowe's, I worked at a bank, and that's where I learned how to work with customer data. And I saw the first customer movement data because we could actually look at the different ATMs, and we would get
Mm,
lat long, who the customer was, and a timestamp. And so that data kind of taught me to look at more than one source of data. And so um, when we fast forward to VF, I went to work for Wrangler Jeans. And the job was a consumer demographics administrator or something like that.
yeah.
So the job description was help us get the right product in the right place at the right time,
Hmm.
localization.
Hmm.
And so it made sense to me that if there was different demography around different stores, that different product would be sold. And so for my presentation, I still had my laptop from consulting. So I got a list of every Walmart in North Carolina. I projected I think a 15-mile or 10-mile radius around each. I pulled the demographics. I had demographics, and so I went into my interview and said, "I believe these stores will sell different product than these stores." I had no idea what product it was because I hadn't seen any of that data. Um, and I found out after the fact that the director who hired me was walking around saying, "Who gave him all that data?" And so the concept was there. I knew how to apply the concept, and I had the tools and the data. And so there, that was the beginning of my VF time because VF owned Wrangler Jeans, um, and we used a system called Conquest. Not Conquest. That was Lowe's Spectra Marketing, which was a
Hmm.
I believe it was Nielsen, at the
Spectra
time.
is Nielsen, yeah.
Yeah. So, I noticed that the geocodes were not verified. I noticed that trade areas, uh, were not correct. For example, a Kohl's store in Wilkesboro, North Carolina, they were using some sort of gravity or spatial interaction model, and that trade area went all the way out into Tennessee, over the Appalachian Mountains into
Yeah.
I had to go out, probably an hour and a half to capture the households that they were reporting, and so we were making product decisions on this. I said, "This is no good," and in
Based
a
on who's on
meeting
the
with
other side of a
yeah,
mountain, yeah.
yeah, we were just talking about Pat Garvey, my partner, and he was from corporate, and we were in a meeting, and I said, "Yeah, this data's not that good," and, somebody said, "Well, that's all we have." I said, "Well, all it is trade area demographics. It's nothing complicated about it." Pat hired me away from Wrangler. He said, "Build a replacement. We're spending like 375,000 a year for two seats." So I did. I built a replacement for it,
Hmm.
and I got I think a 5% raise that year. Saved the company, $400,000 almost. But it was really cool because in that time, I also learned I met Dean Stoker again. I hadn't seen him in
Yeah.
years.
Alteryx, yeah. CEO,
Alteryx.
president of Alteryx, yeah.
Yeah. So he was showing me this tool called Allocate, and he would show me something, and I couldn't believe how fast the data came back. And I said, "What is going on?" And so I called my boss, Pat Garvey. I said, "Hey, I found the tool we need." and we had it within 30 days, and that was the beginning of my Alteryx Alteryx experience. I think that was 2004. So
Hmm.
I've been using Alteryx now for 20, what led up to Alteryx and Alteryx. So anyway, to get all the way back to your question about wholesale, um, and site selection, what we would do was, once I had redeveloped the trade areas, um, we reclustered the stores. Walmart at the time was using something called Store of the Community based on the Spectrum marketing. And we presented to them as to why we believed our data was better. We eventually became category captains, and they used our definitions instead.
Hmm.
But we could marry up the demographics to sales patterns. And there was a certain demographic that bought black Rustler jeans with a 28-inch inseam. And anywhere we saw that, we knew that we had a Mexican population that had moved into the area. It was typically high growth, and that was their work gene. The other thing we learned in this whole process, we still didn't have customer data. We had
Hmm.
wholesale data. We
Right.
had retail sales at our stores. Um, and so we decided we're going to collect some data outside of VF Outlet. And this old lady, probably my age now, but I thought she was old. She she came out. She said, "What are you doing?" I said, "We're collecting customer data. I think we're handing out Tootsie Rolls. You give us your address, we'll give you a Tootsie Roll." And she said, "You guys are wasting your time." And we said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Come with me." And so we followed her. Every returned product to VF Outlets, they had to fill out a card and show their driver's license. So there, we had their addresses. We had the sale. We had, and
Wow.
they were all these index cards stuffed into those paper lunch
Did did
bags.
she did she worked there?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah, and so we hired some temps. We had all those things sent to us, and we had these temps just entering that data. And all of a sudden, we had a customer database for VF Outlets, and we could start making some decisions with it. Well, Pat and I had flown out to Vans, and we were having a meeting trying to
And
get some custom.
Pat was your boss at the
Yeah,
time.
Pat Garvey,
Yeah.
he was my boss. So we flew out to Vans in Orange County, and we're talking about, we needed some customer data to help understand what the trade areas would be to help with store planning. And they said, we don't have any. And I thought, what about returns? And they said, hold on. And they called the guy in from security. He said, oh yeah, every return we collect the name, the total amount on the ticket, and then how, yeah, and so on. So I think that initially we got 140,000 names, huge data set, and so, um, and at the same time all this was going on, we had yeah, just purchased a household-based segmentation system. And so we were able to take that data, that returns data, and append it and come up with a profile. But then they said, don't we have a bunch of ecom data? So we got that data and brought it in. And lo and behold, it was the same profile as who was coming into the store.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
so with that data, we started looking nationally, where should we expand? And so I suggested New York. Um, Again, the president thought I was out of my mind. He said, he asked me, he said, are you nuts? We're a Southern California skate shoe. Yeah. Why would we go to New York? And I said, because it's your number two ecom market,
Hmm.
and it's not that far behind Los Angeles. And so that began the expansion into really outside of California, starting with returns data, and then just keep digging and digging. And so, so that's how we began to really influence where VF would build Vans, North Face, and we just kept looking for more and more data. So,
I'm light bulbing a little bit over here on what made Andy Andy, because you were at Lowe's and it was important to create these trade areas,
yeah,
and then so you had to do these intercepts in order to do
yeah,
that, and then you take this, Lowe's probably has a lot of customer data today,
yeah,
but they didn't then. Okay, then you take this next step into this bank situation where
yeah,
you're getting to see granular customer data in ways that no one sees because you have ATMs.
that's right.
Okay, so that
Yeah,
you're aware this is possible, and then
yeah,
now at VF, you have this. You run into the same issue again, where
yeah,
you're distributing through wholesalers, and you don't get to own that customer relationship, so you
yeah,
don't see as much data. But you discover a unique way to find this customer data. So there's an importance bucket in your mind for
yeah,
finding where these folks are. At
yeah.
what point do you discover mobile data, and what was that like?
Well, it wasn't until after I left VF because, I left VF, I think, in 2010 or 2011, and I was doing consulting work for a bunch of different companies. Alteryx was one of them. I had a several months stint at Walmart, but I was on a call with an executive from a digital marketing company,
Hmm.
and she pulled up some slides with a bunch of push pins in Google Earth. I thought, "What are those?" And, but I wanted to have some time with her by myself, and so I waited until the meeting was over, then I reached out to her, and we were talking. I said, "Tell me about those push pins." She said, "Oh, those are mobile phones." I said, "What do you mean they're mobile phones?" She said, "Yeah, they're GPS. Anytime we're, uh, we're serving up an ad, it's based on the lat long of that phone relative to a target." Yeah,
Hmm.
that was my first exposure to digital marketing, and I thought, "Man, I actually said it out loud, "You're sitting on a gold mine." And that was the beginning of us really getting into mobile data, um, and and Pat, my old boss at VF, became one of my business partners. He thought it was a cool idea too, and I think it was, around COVID or a little bit before, we started getting a daily feed of the US data. Before, we were getting, we would do one geofence at a time. If a grocery store wanted to know something, we'd draw the geofence, yeah, upload the geofence, get the data, and do the analysis. And so somehow we got a daily feed of the all the U.S. data.
Yeah. And
So
this is when I started hearing your name around the industry, and it was particular with grocers. I know
yeah,
you work outside of grocery, but is this
yeah,
for with grocers? A number of them told me like Andy's the only person that I'd trust to use this data for us. So you started getting really good at using this data, and like I said before, I just feel like you have a different perspective
yeah,
because you weren't working internally in those mobile location data companies. You were closer to the actual output and where the decision is made. So let's maybe transition a little bit
okay,
into mobile data. So it's been like I would say one of the biggest innovations in retail site selection in the past decade. It's useful,
absolutely.
but only if you know where it comes from, how it works, and otherwise it can be mislead you. So maybe let's start with there. You kind of touched on this, but what are the different sources that mobile data could come from?
Well, we mentioned Bidstream,
Yep.
and Bidstream, if you catch enough of it over time, you can develop a profile of who the customer is and what the trade areas are. Um, but you really don't get customer movement because it's hit or miss. I think the best data source is SDK. It's a software developer kit, and specifically SDKs that are embedded in location dependent apps. If you think about your weather app, a
Hmm.
weather app can't send you a weather alert if it doesn't know where you are.
Hmm.
And so, uh, you know, I think IBM owns the Weather Channel, and the Weather Channel has an app, and so they have a lot of data. Weather Bug is another one. There are insurance companies that, yeah, if you agree to let them put the app on the phone, they can monitor your driving, and that throws off data all the time. There are location sharing, uh, yeah, apps, and so those types of SDKs that are throwing off data every, yeah, depending on the app, could be every 5 seconds, it could be every 15 seconds, but that gets into billions, yeah, of pings. And what a ping is the device ID, timestamp, and lat long. And by the way, at this point, the the device ID is encrypted. It's, yeah, hashed, and so because early data had the mobile advertising ID that was associated with it. Well, that was deemed, yeah, a lot of legislation has uh,
Yeah.
changed, arrived
So
to protect privacy.
it's changed that, so there's also
Yeah,
mobile ad
yeah,
IDs available, although they are available, and then there's
yeah,
also the Apple ID, and
yeah,
that pretty much got shut down totally.
yeah. So, but there was still data, a persistent ID, and
Right. Yep.
that's what's important. It doesn't. I'm not sure in my work. I'm not trying to reach people.
Not
Uh,
trying to target them. You just need to know that this is a
yeah,
persistent ID.
yeah, and specifically, so we can tie it back to some residential component. And so the SDK based data is the best data in my mind. Connected cars,
Yep.
that's another source of data. We processed a couple of years worth of connected car data that was aggregated to roads, directional road segments in 15-minute increments. And even aggregated like that, it was something like 7 trillion rows of data. And it was really cool to help understand traffic again. Um, but the no persistent ID was available. So again, for what we do, SDK with uh, a location specific application, I think that is
Yeah.
the very best data.
And let's talk about the accuracy. So,
Yeah,
how do providers actually determine that there was a store visit? And then what is the reliability of that latitude and longitude ping on
yeah.
whether someone actually went into the store or just drove past or into the store next to it?
So, um, GPS-based location data is typically within 3 and 5 meters. Um, and so, it's accurate enough to if it says it's in your store, it probably is in your store. We have some, clients that have stores that are just off the street, only a little bit of a grassy area and then a small sidewalk. Well, if it's 3 to 5 meters, yeah, data from the road could actually be showing up in that store. So in those cases, what we like to do is restrict or retract the geofence, so we have a little bit of a buffer, so we don't capture that kind of data. But if it's if you've got a ping inside a store, it probably is very close to that. Um, I mentioned the sidewalks. If you share a wall with another retailer, um, you've got a buffer that because you can't with confidence say, "Oh, they were here, not there," and vice versa. Um, we've had clients that have asked us to geofence these little inline spaces within a small center that are maybe 20 feet across, and we just tell them, no, that's not a good, yeah,
Mhm.
geofence that little center, get the total for the center and look at that. Don't, yeah, it's, and then you have all sorts of interference that can, yeah, mess up your data. Line of sight, if I actually read the term urban valleys. Um,
Okay.
so, so that is, if you think about walking in Manhattan, um,
Sure. Okay.
you've got a lot of interference vertically from potentially where that satellite is. Um,
Mhm.
and the last time I was in New York, I was looking at my did the same thing with Google Earth, and I was looking, and I was bouncing around all over the place, but never moving.
Yep.
So, um, and then if you think about a store on the bottom of one of those skyscrapers, there's no way you can say with any
Right.
certainty that that's valid. So you can have a storm, you can have uh, a disruption in the ionosphere. I actually looked this up because I wanted to impress you, But so there are things that get in the way, but typically, if you've got an open area, then it's going to be a good reading. You do get some interruption once you go inside the store a lot of times. So, so I if you can get enough pings inside the store to do the analysis you want to do, that's great. But I personally don't mind looking at a little bit of the front of the store, yeah, just in front of it because people are still on their phones. You still have line of sight, and you're still going to capture a lot of data.
That
So,
was really helpful to kind of
yeah,
break that up.
yeah,
What about the other end of it? So we talked about the store, but you'll see this mobile data attached to demographics in some way. And we
yeah.
already, agreed that these things are anonymized mobile IDs. So we don't actually have the demographics on the people. So how are the providers doing that?
The way that it's working now is that most providers will give you the block group that that phone resides in. And so let's talk about Persona Live with 80 segments. Um,
Yeah, and just so
not,
people know what Andy's talking about, Persona Live segmentation, U.S. households, and it's a geographic segmentation. So we know what people are, different high income or low income segments in a particular
yeah.
block group.
So it's probably not likely that all 80 are in a block group.
Hmm.
Um, the I know that when I was working with Mosaic, the average number of Mosaic segments in a block group was around 30. And so the way that providers can attach segmentation, well, demographics, uh, it's based on the block group and you weight it. So, and every company has their own way of weighting, uh, their own methodology. And so with segmentation, let's say you have 30 Persona Live segments um, and you have 100 visits from this block group. Well, you multiply 100 times that distribution, and you do that for every block group that's uh, producing visits, and then you roll it up and you divide it by the total number uh, in that yeah of that aggregate area, and then you get your distribution for who visited that store. We looked at that our PWP process versus block group appending, um, and every yeah when we looked at it in mass, the I think the correlation was 0.94 or something.
Yeah, I mean, I was about to say we've done the same thing. So we've
Yeah,
attached it to the household, we've attached it to a hexagonal grid, and we've attached it
yeah.
to the census block group. When you do weighted distributions on census block groups, it's about right.
Yeah. I think for the, um, increasing privacy concerns, block group is probably gonna be the
That's the
way
way
to
to
go.
go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so but that's how we do it. There's another component to that, and that is how do you weight those visits? What's your penetration rate of that market with your SDK panel? So
Hmm.
there's another piece to it other than just saying, okay, you have 100 from this block group, it's 100 times the distribution, roll it up. Well, you may be over penetrated in that market, you may be under penetrated, and so that's where you have to analyze how well your panel represents that
Yeah.
area.
So
And
and let's talk about the panels and extrapolations
yeah,
too. So I generally my understanding is that the panel looks like usually about 5% if we're lucky in a particular market. And then there's extrapolations that are made where we're saying this the estimated visits. And am I about right on the panel size? And then how are the estimated visits done? And what are the watchouts there?
I think one of the watch outs is, well, where'd you come up with that 5%? You
Yeah,
know?
well tell me.
So I can't tell you that. I don't know what it's. I think there are ways, and I think this is really important for the end user. Um,
Mhm.
when they subscribe to a mobile company, um, one of the first things I tell them to do is get the data and see how well it compares to reality.
Yep,
And the correlation, and you can't just do it on sales because not every segment purchases at the same rate. And so
sure.
there's some homework that needs to be done.
Yeah, I mean, and we kind of I'm being very intentional about pointing out all these issues because I think there was a general people were very excited about mobile
Yeah,
data when it first
yeah,
started coming out, and they thought it was the holy grail, hallelujah, and they're very disappointed when something it doesn't measure up with the accuracy that they expect. And my kind of my intention in going through this is let's look at the issues with it. But what do you want to do once you know the issues?
yeah,
Because you could ignore it
yeah.
and have none of that data. And do you prefer that? When in fact, like this is very, very useful and
Yeah,
continues to be useful.
it is absolutely. Yeah, a few things have happened in my 40 years. Desktop mapping with GIS. That was the number one. Second was, I think it was in 1990 when the Census Bureau started using the Tiger files. And all of a sudden, all these files and block group data was available and so on. And nothing really got me excited again until Alteryx, early mid 2000s. And then at the same time to that was the understanding of how important segmentation was. But the mobile data, um, the ability to see customer movement is, I think that is the most important piece of data we've seen in a long time, and especially when you attach segmentation to it. I was working with Dr. Ron Mitchelson. He was the chair at East Carolina. We were working on a spatial interaction, a Huff model together for a grocer. And I kept talking about block groups, block groups, block groups. And he got so frustrated with me, he finally said, Andy, when's the last time you saw a block group walk in a store and buy something? He said, it's not about block groups, it's about customer choice. And so mobile data demonstrates customer choice all the time. But the point is that mobile data is really the only way for you to understand customer movement. Yeah, there's work to do with calibrating how you use it, but it's worth the effort because there's nothing else like it.
Okay, Andy, well, let's get into the product that you developed and that we're at Spatial now working on integrating into our segmentation, the mobility grid. Can you explain for the audience what that is?
The mobility grid is almost exactly what it was named. We were working with a client and we were depicting where the target customers lived. And through discussions, we all came up with the idea of depicting where the target customers are when they're not at home. Um, And so we thought, well, how are we going to do that? Well, I had played around with grid cells before the H3 grid system came about. I built one myself for the US. I spent months tinkering with it. Um, but the cool thing about the H3 grid system is it's not perfectly nested, but um, it's a group of hexagons that kind of fit together. And when you go from resolution 1 to 2, then there's 7 grid cells for every one, and so on and so on. Buddy of mine, Scott Wade, who teaches at East Carolina, I told him about it, and I found the code. So Scott um, teaches geography at East Carolina, and he developed a Python routine, and so we just had to give it the spatial bounds, and it created the grid overlay for us. So
So
that
the
was one.
mobility grid, so it's a hexagonal representation
Yes.
in the United States, not of where people live, but of where they are going to.
Well, the grid is independent of data, so the grid is just it's almost like any other geographic boundary, and so but it's uniform, and which is key to understanding what the grid is depicting, because you don't have to interpret a small grid cell versus a large, or like
Hmm.
with block groups and zip codes and so on. That's the attractive one of the most attractive things about the grids for me is that you don't have to teach somebody how to interpret uh, the results. And so that was one piece. With all the data that we had been uh, downloading every day, yeah, each one of those had a lat long with it and a timestamp. So we had to go from raw, all these raw pings, and get them from that into grid cells um, by day, by hour, by device. That hashed ID. And it was critical to do it by device so that we could then go back and attach the segmentation to it.
Yep.
Um, there are about 12.5 million grid cells to cover the US in its entirety. Realistically, 97% of all mobile activity happens in about 2 million grid cells.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so, you don't have to map the great cornfields on the plains, because nobody's there. Nobody's going to make a business decision off of that data. So we identified those grid cells that were the most important. Now, when we built it, we went ahead and built it for all 12 plus million. And what people are going to see when we do the webinar is being able to pick which segments you want to see. They get, you know, put together by day part. And so all of a sudden you get to see where your best segments are, those that you're targeting, um, anywhere in the country. You know, I know it sounds simple, um, but we went from these, yeah, billions and billions of trillion observations to something that uh,
Right.
in your platform, someone can go in there and say, you know what, I want to look at Raising Cane's. You can identify those segments. You do it for them anyway. In just a matter of a minute, you pick what you want to see and say, okay, map these. And then all of a sudden, you can see where those top segments are um, immediately. Yeah, I'm from the South. I love fried chicken. We don't have a Raising Cane's here in Greensboro. So I put that on the map and said, you know, where they should go to, where they should look if they were coming. I looked today because we were going to do this podcast, and on the map in the top segment there's a Raising Cane's, you know,
No
and
kid.
yeah. So it's just
There you go. I didn't. You didn't tell me about that. You held that back on me. It's a
I
little
just
validation.
found out today. I was, and it's so the without any information from Raising Cane's, um, just what you have put together with Persona Live, and me taking your data and matching it up to the mobility grid, um, we identified their number one spot in Greensboro. And the cool thing is you can do that anywhere in the country uh, in just a matter of minutes. And so the beauty of the mobility grid is you go from like zero to looking at developing market strategies in just minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so the and getting back to why did we do this? Because it's a lot of data. It's a lot of processing, and not every yeah. If I had my job at Lowe's or VF and I wanted a mobility grid, I couldn't have done it by myself. One, I didn't have access to the data. Two, I don't have the bandwidth. I wouldn't have the bandwidth because I had my day job. And so the idea was to make it easy for everyone else to use it. Yeah, I am an
Mm-hmm.
entrepreneur, so yeah, I want to sell it. Um, but I had no idea just how accessible it was going to be until y'all threw it up into your platform. And all of a sudden, how many brands do you have in there?
Yeah, it's like over 2,000 brands.
Over 2,000 brands. You can just go click, click, click.
Yeah.
We're their best customers.
I'm kind of piecing together your, you know, career and also the growth of technology
Yeah,
throughout that. And
hand
you
in hand.
mentioned it. You
Yeah,
mentioned it like, Tiger GIS files came on,
yeah,
so that was easier to attach information to census block
yeah,
groups. And then we had segmentation became
yeah,
more of an important thing. Then the mobility data
yeah.
became an important thing. And then sort of all these different components are now starting to come into play. And
That's
then
right.
from my experience with the mobility grid, my first reaction to it was like in my mind, I'm very used to seeing census block groups and analyzing trade areas by those census block groups.
Yeah,
And the first time you see it, it's not census block groups. It's a hexagonal grid, and you'll
yeah,
notice that the it highlights retail areas, and it does not necessarily highlight the residential areas. And then the light bulb went off for me, which is like, you don't plop down your stores in residential areas, you
no,
plop them down in proximity to where they shop.
yeah,
So it aligns your eye correctly.
yeah,
So that speeds some things up, and it's a very different way of looking at it. And then the next piece here is the segmentation data. So, okay, is the traffic there? Yes or no? But is it my best segments?
yeah,
And I think what we've brought along here from the segmentation component
yeah,
is, in the past, the only way to know your best segments is you would have to work directly with that brand, get the data from the
yeah,
brand, attach it to
yeah,
segmentation, and then rank your segments, which now there's a new piece of technology here where we
yeah,
have all of your brands ranked by mobile data. So we know all the segments visitation to the mobile data. We also know the credit card data. We know what they're spending. And so there's not that the whole time when you're, working
yeah,
manually with the data, you already know the best segments for every one of these brands.
yeah,
And you can just press the button on the segment and then turn the map on and you immediately get that. And then my turnaround moment was this. I shared this data with one retailer and getting feedback because I was like, this is so different than how I'm used to this. And they looked at one particular grid and they were like, "Hey, can we zoom in on that grid?" And they're like, "Well, we actually have a site planned in that grid." And they had done so much work to
yeah,
to get to that answer
yeah,
when we clicked a button and we got immediately to the answer. And then again, they're like, "Hey, can you just go south of there? There's another grid that was highlighted." And they're like, "That is where we are looking to locate next." And so my light bulb moment was, all right, this might be um real estate site selection for dummies, etc.
Yeah.
But what's actually there's like an underpinning a lot of fundamentals of
Yes.
retail location intelligence that are underneath this,
Yeah.
and it's essentially getting you to those answers
Yeah.
faster, which is what makes me really excited about it.
When I was first showing you this, you said you asked me, "Andy, what am I missing? It seems too simple."
Right. No, that's what I was trying to for a month I was searching for what am I missing here? This
Yeah.
just seems way too simple.
And again, it's simple because of what you did on your end and what we did on our end, and we put them together. And again, how smoothly it works on your platform, that's just I'm just amazed.
Now, how does this interact, would you say, with like a predictive model? So some retailers, they already have their predictive model
Yeah.
and they say sort of have those locations. Is there still a reason to use mobility grid even if you have some sort of predictive model?
You can build an iterative white space model that goes through and just, yeah, identifies which are good to consider, and looking at competition and all that kind of stuff. So that's one way. I recently used the mobility grid in a regression model, and it was a single the target traffic, primary and secondary. And when I say that, I'm talking about um, those two groups of segments that are responsible for 75% of all visitation. Um, I looked at the primary, the secondary, but what was number one was those two groups. Uh, um, wasn't total visitation; it was that target segmentation.
I mean, that's nice and validating, right? That
Yeah,
it's the people that are
yeah,
showing up there are driving the sales.
yep.
Yep. Well, Andy, I think you've given us a really clear view of mobile data, what it's like now, where it's heading. If you had to leave listeners with one mindset shift or a single important way they should be thinking about trade areas or customer movement over the next 5 years, what would that be?
I think trade areas are important, really important, especially when you're talking about modeling. Yeah, you need to understand that base. Um, you really have to with the customer movement data, the mobile data, you're going to see that people have different make different choices on different days, and trade areas overlap. They don't adhere to those radii like that one client who I have offended thought. So the so as you move forward, um, the mobile data, especially as privacy laws continue to force the SDK app folks to aggregate data before uh, it goes out. Um, I think that the mobility grid is going to become more and more important because, I think it was like 1,650 feet in Maryland and Oregon and
Yep.
1,750 feet everywhere else, which is almost exactly the radius of the H3 Resolution 8,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
which
yeah.
is which is cool. So if we start learning how to use this mobility grid, we can protect people's privacy, but
Right.
still get at that understanding that businesses need to make good fact-based decisions.
I think you're on the money with that because and we didn't even talk about this, but we talked about the particular parcel. If it's small,
Yeah,
then it's going to be really difficult to identify a visit to that particular parcel. But we're not trying to identify visits to parcels. We're
yeah,
identifying visits to hexagonal grids, which are
yeah,
considerably larger. Now, is
yeah.
it going to be a solution for you to find the estimated visits to a particular retailer? No, that's not what it's
Mm-mm.
for. It's a solution to help you get to the areas where your
Yeah,
customers are shopping.
yeah,
And for that reason, it doesn't suffer from some of the issues that people will use mobile data for, which is trying to estimate a small parcel or any other, just edge case. It
yeah,
doesn't suffer some of those issues. That's awesome. Well,
Yeah.
if you guys have liked this conversation, I always like nerding out with Andy. We are going to be doing a webinar on October the 8th, where we're actually going to show you the mobility grid in action. So that is what's next. Andy, any parting thoughts for us as we close this out?
Uh, Only that whoever's listening to this, if you have some ideas, some things you'd like to see in the webinar, we might pick a few of those as examples. And so you guys know how to get in touch with Leiden. So, you know, bombard him with ideas. So,
Rock and roll. Thank you,
all right.
Andy.
Thank you. Take care.